Thank you and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our session today. And this is a webinar on Editors in Action, lightning talks on improving DEI in academic journals. My name's Caroline Porter. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Associate VP for Research Publishing at SAGE. I'm also a trustee of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Also, a big thank you to colleagues within SAGE for helping to set up this session, and of course to our panel speakers who I'll introduce momentarily. So just to outline our agenda today, I have a bit of housekeeping for you, and then a few words just about SAGE's work on improving DEI in academic journals. We then have our lightning talk from the panel, and following that is plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions. So in this session, we have a group of SAGE journal editors presenting lightning talks on their DEI journal activities, and so much good work has been done by editors of SAGE journals, which we want to share more widely in order to give examples of good practice and to demonstrate the benefits of positive action to support scholars from historically marginalised groups. The aim here is to share knowledge, but also ideas or avenues that are being explored. And I think it's fair to say that no one individual or journal or publisher is going to solve what are some quite serious systemic issues around historical and current issues of bias and prejudice. But by working together, we can take steps in the right direction. Next slide, Sean. So just on the housekeeping, we would love you to ask us questions. We can't have everybody on camera, so all attendees will be muted and cameras switched off apart from our speakers. However, we're really keen that this is an interactive session and to get lots of questions from our participants. So please post any questions that you have in the Q&A. You can upvote questions as well, which will help bring them to the top of the list, and it will help me to see which questions are the most salient with those of you joining us today. The meeting will be recorded, and we will be made available after the session. So just a few words briefly about work we're doing on DEI at SAGE before I hand over to the panel. There's a lot of work that we're doing as an employer, which is really out of scope for today's session, but suffice to say that we are very aware that we, along with other publishers, need to do more to ensure that our workplace and our culture are equitable and inclusive, and there is a lot of activity underway throughout our organisation in support of that aim. We also want to play our part as an academic publisher in ensuring that the work we produce is representative of diverse voices, and that authors of all backgrounds are able to publish with us. And so my specific area of focus is on the journal side of the business, and I chair our Research Publishing DEI task force. The aim of that task force is to remove and prevent barriers in journal publishing for historically marginalised people and communities. Now, that's a very aspirational goal, but I think it's really important that this is our goal, to remove barriers and ensure that our journals can publish diverse voices. But we can only achieve that by working in collaboration with our editors, society partners, and with the wider academic community. We're also working across the industry in collaboration with other publishers and organisations to learn and share ideas. So the work of our research publishing DEI task force is split into 4 working streams: content, application, representation, and data. And I'm not going to try and capture all of the various work going on within those streams, because I'm conscious that we want to hear from our panel, but I wanted to share a couple of highlights from each of them. So the content stream is working on a suite of new resources and has published inclusive language guidelines, as well as expanded information on reducing bias in peer review. and those are both aimed at editors, but they are publicly available on our website. They're also working on some additional guidance in support of citational justice. The application stream really works to highlight the work that we publish that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. Amongst other things, they are working on plain language summaries to support accessibility and dissemination. They also maintain our name change policy, which enables changes to author names and pronouns to be made. And they produce and develop thematic microsites to highlight work published by SAGE on a range of social justice and DEI related topics. And finally, they work on a series of webinars for authors on how to get published, and that supports authors from all backgrounds, including early career researchers. The representation stream is working on a number of projects just to improve the representation of diverse voices in our journals. Today's webinar was developed by that stream, and so very happy to be part of this. And the idea, as I say, behind this session is to share knowledge and ideas for the research publishing community, and especially for journal editors who are looking to diversify their content. That stream is also working on support for authors writing in English as a second language, and it has produced a toolkit for SAGE staff, for publishing editors who are working in collaboration with journal editors and societies to support this agenda. Finally, we have a data stream which enables us to really try and understand the makeup of our journals, of our author base, of our editorial boards better. And that stream has worked on a demographic data collection pilot via Scholar One, and it's also working on a survey of editors and editorial boards. So more to come on all of that, and I'm really looking forward to us being able to sort of measure and demonstrate progress over time. Just before I go on to introduce the panel members, I wanted to just show this example. I mentioned microsites earlier, and we have a number of these collections on the SAGE Journals platform, and it brings together content in support of particular themes. So please feel free to browse that content at your leisure. So to introduce the panel, we're very lucky to have with us 4 speakers who are involved with SAGE Journals. Amina Abaka is Associate Editor of International Journal of Behavioural Development and is a Professor and Director for the Institute of Human Development at Aga Khan University, Nairobi, Kenya. Chloe Marshall is Editor of First Language and Emerita Professor of Psychology, Language and Education at UCL's Institute of Education in the UK. Her research focuses on children's language and cognitive development, and she used to co-lead the MA/MSc Educational Neuroscience taught jointly by the Institute of Education and Birkbeck. Rosa Hookstra is Editor of Autism. She is a reader in Global Perspectives on Neurodevelopmental Disabilities at King's College London's Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. She also co-leads the NIHR UK-funded SPARK project, which aims to improve support for children with developmental disabilities and their families in Ethiopia and Kenya. Finally, Deborah Christie has been Editor of Clinical Child Psychology and Psychiatry since 2018. She has long championed diversity and inclusion, working to ensure equal opportunities and safe spaces for all. She is Professor of Paediatric and Associate Adolescent Psychology, a transformational life coach and consultant at University College London Hospitals and Dartford and Gravesham NHS Trusts. So without further ado, let's get into our lightning talks. A huge thank you to all our panel speakers today, and really looking forward to hearing from you all. So Amina, over to you.
Thank you. So I will start by apologizing. I hope my network is strong enough and people can hear me clearly. I'm somewhere where the internet and the electricity is a bit unstable. So my talk is really to set the ground for the discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will largely try to frame the problem and just give a bit of statistics on what are the challenges being faced. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So if you think of academia in general, we know that inclusion, diversity, and equity is a real challenge. And the challenge is about, affects, academics in all educational level and career level. And because of that, we find many underrepresented groups. This can be females, this could be by geographical, sections whereby some geographies are not represented. So we find that this is not just a problem for publishing, although today we are focusing on publishing. I just thought it's important to highlight that. Next, please. So to really look at the extent of the problem in terms of inclusion and diversity within academic journals, I would just like to highlight a recently published study where someone carried out a review of more than 600 peer-reviewed academic journals. And although this really focused on environmental, some of the real highlighting findings, I would like, next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, I would like to highlight some of the key findings from this research, whereby women and gender minorities only made up a third of the editorial boards, and only 25% of editors-in-chief for these journals were women or gender minorities. And, it was observed that over 80% of the editorial board members were from high-income countries, with most of the representation being from North America. And then fewer than 5% of the editorial board members were based in lower middle income or low income countries. And what was really outstanding is 0.1% of the editors were women based in low middle income countries. And this really highlights the inequity in terms of representation in journal editorial boards. And these findings are not just unique to environmental or public health. We find that similar findings have been reported in other fields such as neuroscience, psychology, and, so although there may be differences in the rates, but I think there was only one field, and that is occupational therapy, where we had more women than men in the editorial boards. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's been some thoughts around how do we actually address the issue of lack of equity and diversity in editorial boards. And there's this key, what has been named as the key to reducing inequity. I know the figure is not very clear, but I think beyond the details, what this figure tries to show us is that we really need all the different stakeholders to be involved to address the issue of diversity, from the authors themselves in the way they set up studies and the way they involve people in the research, to peer reviewers, ensuring we select peer reviewers who are sensitive and, from diverse setting, the journal editorial boards, the funders, and, so that to really be able to improve the aspects of equity. So within the journal I sit on the editorial board, we use various strategies to be able to enhance equity. Our board is quite diverse. I think we have people from almost all the continents represented in the board, and therefore we are able to look at articles from a very diverse kind of eye. In selecting reviewers, personally, I make an effort to ensure there is a diverse set of reviewers, and especially someone from the context in which the article emanated from, so as we really get a sense of how the message being sent out resonates with that context, but also selection of content. So our journal is really an international journal for behavioral development, and an effort is made to invite and get articles from all the different players in the field. And lastly, while reviewing, looking at articles, we do consider the fact that not all authors will be, speakers of English as a first language, and therefore we send them out for language editing whenever needed. Next, please. Now, I know in terms of equity and diversity and inclusivity today, there's quite a strong focus on the editorial board, but I would like to highlight that one of the key things beyond the editorial board is open science, which has a lot of many benefits, but it does bring many other challenges for those with, fewer resources. For instance, when we are expecting authors to be able to curate, store, and manage their data and share it, do they have the resources needed? But also sometimes publishing can be very costly, especially for those who come from less resource setting. I do hope my internet was strong enough for you to hear me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amina, and the internet held up well for you there, so thank you. Just a reminder to post any questions in the Q&A, and I will now hand over to Chloe.
Thank you, Caroline. So I'm Chloe Marshall. I'm Editor-in-Chief of First Language, and my role in this webinar is to discuss how at First Language we're making efforts to increase the diversity of our editorial team. So Sean, if you could show the next slide, please. This is the editorial team for First Language. We include 10 associate editors and 22 editorial board members. Our reviewing model is that associate editors handle the review of manuscripts. They make a recommendation directly to me, and I make all final decisions and communicate those with authors. Our editorial board members play a very active role. So they undertake to review up to 4 manuscripts a year. Not every manuscript is reviewed by an editorial board member, but many are. Next slide, please. So First Language publishes research on how children acquire language, and our efforts to diversify the editorial team at First Language are driven by the most important overarching question in our field. And that question is, which aspects of language acquisition are firstly shared across cultures and languages, and secondly shaped by culture and language? And our field has realized from its inception several decades ago that in order to fully understand how children learn language, we need data from a range of languages and cultures. And sorry, Sean, I should have asked you to move on to the next slide. You were quite right. Thank you. But even though we realize that we need data from a range of languages and cultures, the literature in our field, and this may not surprise you, the literature in our field is dominated by studies of English, and also by some other languages from the same language family, from Indo-European. And our literature is also dominated by weird cultures, in other words, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, by the minority of the world's cultures. And a recent survey by Evan Kidd and Rowena Garcia shows that we have data in our field's major journals from just 1.5% of the world's 7,000 languages. That is a pitiful situation. Thank you, Sean. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of discussion as to how we change this situation and who's responsible for driving change. Obviously, in the context of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the role of editors. So next slide, please. So what are we doing at First Language to diversify our editorial board and our editorial team? Well, first of all, we're expanding country representation among associate editors, editorial board members, guest editors of special issues, and reviewers. For the sake of this talk, I'm taking expansion in country representation as a proxy for expansion in the number of languages and cultures that our team has expertise in. Obviously, looking at a list of the editorial's team's affiliations, like the one we showed you earlier, that does, of course, hide a lot of relevant expertise, including, for example, whether team members have expertise in sign languages or in conditions such as autism that can affect language acquisition. But this is a short talk. So anyway, I think we're actually on to the next slide, if that's okay, please, Sean.
Sure.
So I'm talking about what our rationale is for expanding country representation in our editorial team. So there are at least two important reasons for doing this. And the first is that expanding the country representation of our editorial team gives us access to a more diverse network of reviewers with wider expertise. So not just in the field of language acquisition, but likely in your fields as well. Reviewers and editors act as gatekeepers. They decide what research gets published. And for us, we need reviewers who have first-hand knowledge of the challenges of studying children in underrepresented cultures and children who are learning underrepresented languages. We don't want to be rejecting papers that have potential value just because those papers don't adhere to the methodological expectations that we have from English and for other well-studied languages. And the second reason is that having broader country representation in our editorial team sends an important message to authors that we actively value country and therefore language and culture diversity. And reviewers and authors are, of course, potential editorial board members in due course. And as I'm trying to show in this maybe not very clear figure on the slide, when we bring in scholars at each point, authors, reviewers, editors, we're hopefully creating a virtuous circle, a circle that reinforces so that greater diversity is embedded in our journal. Thank you. Next slide, please, Sean. So how are we actually expanding country representation among our editorial team? Well, we have our own contacts, of course, but we're going beyond that to deliberately search among the authors and reviewers who've contributed to our journal. And we're also deliberately searching for people who are presenting at international conferences. In other words, we're looking beyond our contacts to find out who is doing good work in this area. Next slide, please, Sean. So in this rather busy slide, I'm presenting data on the country representation of the editorial team for First Language in 2015, which is 2 years prior to my taking over as editor, and in 2023. So the numbers show how many team members there are from each country. In both 2015 and now, the greatest representation is from the UK and the US, and that's not likely to change much because lots of excellent work in the field is being done by scholars in these two countries, and these two countries attract top international scholars. But you'll see a greater number of countries represented now compared to 8 years ago. And importantly, we have representation from all the continents. Now, I'm painfully aware that for Asia, South America and Africa, this representation looks very tokenistic. We are still actively working on identifying potential team members from those continents. So we're moving in the direction, but we still have a huge amount to do in order to embed meaningful geographical diversity in our team, but we're on our way. And the next slide, please, Sean. This will be my final slide. So finally, is our strategy working? Is it allowing us to achieve a greater diversity in the papers submitted to and published in First Language? Well, unfortunately, it's always difficult to determine cause and effect in these situations. I am fairly certain that since we appointed an editorial board member from Argentina, we've had a sharp increase in the number of manuscripts to consider from South America, which is good to see. And we do seem to be getting a wider range of languages in the papers submitted to us. So here are two that we've currently published on the Ethiopian language Oromo and the Indigenous Canadian language Northern East Cree. But I have also noticed that appointing two very well-respected and well-known deaf sign language experts to the editorial team has not yet resulted in the submissions on the acquisition of sign languages that I'd hoped to see. So there is a lot more work still to be done. Anyway, my time is up. Thank you for your patience when I dropped out. I'll leave it there and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you to everyone for bearing with us just with the small technical glitch there. I'm now handing over to Rosa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for having me here today. So I'm Rosa Hookstra and I'm editor on the journal Autism. And I worked with 4 guest editors on a special issue that I wanted to showcase the autism research that happens across the globe, and especially that happens in countries and contexts that are typically underrepresented in the autism literature. Like the issues that have been outlined by previous speakers, by Professor Abaka and Professor Marshall, the autism literature is highly skewed towards publishing research from high-income context, especially from North America and Europe. And in this special issue, Autism Research in a Global Context, we wanted to showcase research from contexts that are typically underrepresented in the literature, particularly from countries, low and middle income countries. And so for this special issue, I teamed up with 4 guest editors, 3 of whom are from the Global South. They are Dr. Gauri Divan from India, Dr. Mudin Bakare from Nigeria, Professor Chung-Xin Chang from Taiwan, and Dr. Michelle Villabolo, originally from Mexico, but living in the US. And we were really excited when we found that there was huge interest to take part in this special issue. So after we published a call for abstracts, we received over 80 abstract submissions. And in the end, 19 of these were accepted as full papers in our special issue. Most of the submitted or published articles are already available in advanced online view. The official special issue, the paper version, will be published in January 24. Next slide, please. Yeah, so when we were working as a team of 5 editors, we were really thinking, well, how can we use this special issue also as a force for longer good in diversifying the publication pipeline as a whole? And so one important requirement that we set for people submitting to our special issue is that we insisted that there was author representation from the country where the study was conducted. So what we wanted to avoid was that there were undoubtedly highly motivated, well-meaning researchers from a high-income context going to a low-income context to collect data from this context that is little represented in the autism literature, collecting the data, leaving to go back to the high-income country, and then publishing the results with no involvement of local authors. And so we said you have to have local author representation. And we were then really pleased that the journal as a whole also decided to adopt this policy. So in the screenshot you see here on the right-hand side is the revised aims and scope for the journal Autism. And the second paragraph outlines these requirements that you need to have local author representation. So we had guest editors from the Global South. So we also ensured that the people who make these editorial decisions on the work that had been submitted really knew about the low-income context or the global context, rather than primarily coming into their editorial decision-making from an experience of being based in North America or in Europe. And these editors also prioritized inviting reviewers from the Global South. Of course, it's easier if you are from a context, you know local colleagues or colleagues who work in the region. So you're perhaps in a better position to invite reviewers who really know the work on your continent. And we felt that this was really important in evaluating the work that had been submitted. But we also thought this could longer term help diversify the reviewer pool for the journal. These new reviewers are now on the journal system, so it will be easier to invite them for future manuscripts too. And then later on, they can join the editorial board or they can become editor on the journal. Next slide, please. I think there is one slide in between still, and if that one has gone lost, then I'll just improvise. So we also really wanted to think about possible barriers to publishing. One of the barriers, already also alluded to with some of the previous speakers, is language. Most people in the Global South don't have English as their first language. And the journal publisher Sage made free language editing available for a selection of manuscripts to be published in the special issue. And this really allowed us editors to evaluate the work based on the scientific merit of the work rather than whether it was written in perfect academic English. The other possible barrier, or very important barrier, in fact, is open access publishing. And for this specific special issue, the publisher waived the open access publication fees so that the work can be read throughout the world, and especially in the global south, if you have no access to a high income institution with lots of access to journal licenses, by publishing open access and waiving that open access fee, the work in the special issue is openly accessible for all. I'll finish with saying that we're really excited to work on the special issue and really look forward to all the work coming out by January 24. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa, and apologies that a slide got lost in the ether somewhere. Okay, handing over now to Deborah, please.
Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. I'm the editor of Clinical Child Psychology and Psychiatry. It was established in 1996 by a clinical colleague, Professor Brian Lask, in order to bridge a gap, to reach the parts that other journals can't reach, was the phrase that Brian used. And it was about this dichotomy between the idea of empirical research being the truth, whilst others, as Brian said, held on to a view that the only source of useful knowledge was clinical practice. So the difference between evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. And CCPP has always been a forum for both research and clinical practice in order to think about how they can work alongside each other. So on the next slide, I have put in, and if you just click again, Sean, there should be, no, go back one. The picture's gone. That's okay, it wasn't all that good. But the point about the CCPP was to create an interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journal. And in the first 2 years of joining the journal, along with the editorial board, we rewrote our aims and objectives to try and expand from just children and adolescents to young adults. So we increased the research that we took to address emerging adults. And in addition, we tried to emphasize that it wasn't just for psychologists and psychiatrists, but was for all practitioners, all healthcare researchers, and patient support groups that were interested in clinical psychological well-being. Next slide. One of the things that I was very keen on was trying to make sure that the editorial board reflected the diversity and equity and inclusivity that we were trying to encourage within the journal. And so when I started, I went through the board and I invited those people that had been on the board for some time who hadn't participated to perhaps consider retiring, and replaced those positions with people who represented greater diversity. And so you can see that currently we have a 9:6 gender ratio, that we have 3 people of color on the board. We have 2 people who are part of the LGBTQ+A community who self-identify as being within that community. That we, at the moment, we're not great. We're kind of very UK based, very UK centric. But when we were first started, it was very much a non-international journal, and so we started inviting people from North America, and recently we've included somebody from India. And Professional-wise, we have a mix of psychiatrists, psychologists, family medicine, pediatric, and adolescent health specialists. We're missing social work at the moment, and it would be good to increase our LMIC representation. On the next slide, this is really how we approached the issue. We started including DEI discussions in all of our board meetings. So our board meetings have small breakout room conversations with a topic for development, and we've included DEI in the last 3 years. Each of the initiatives that are created as a result of these conversations are reviewed and developed. We have also taken advantage of the plain language summary initiative that SAGE has introduced. We're still getting our head around that, but it's come in. Some of the plain language summaries are quite funny. They're basically the abstracts rewritten with different headings, but we're going to work on that. We're also using the SAGE free trial of English language editorial support. So where we find papers that have been submitted where English is not the first language of the authors, we ask reviewers to review for the science, and we then encourage the authors to use the free editorial support to have their papers rewritten, and then we also include the revisions. I've just started using the Web of Science recommendations for reviewers, which is very helpful because that produces a list of people that have published in the area or who have reviewed in the area, and I'm able to, well, again, use a proxy of location or name. Sometimes it's a bit of guesswork, but I try to avoid who is very clearly not particularly representative of diversity. And we're also encouraging, and this is something that came out of our board meeting discussions, we're also encouraging people that are invited to review to ask less senior colleagues to review with support. So we're including less of the old boys, I guess you would say. We're trying to get away from that real old boys club that really has existed in the past. With the last 2 slides, for those people who are watching, who may prefer their information visually, this is a view of where the majority of our reviewers have come from in the last 18 months. And you can see that we're still very UK, North American heavy, with 66%, 70%, sorry, coming from the UK, Northern Ireland, North America and Canada. However, the other way of understanding this is that 30% are coming from other places in the world. And this is really just our first 18 months worth of initiatives. And we're starting to get reviewers from South America, from South Africa, North Africa, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, China, India and Australia, Indonesia, New Zealand. So we're just beginning to pick up reviewers, and we're making and I think one of the other speakers mentioned the fact that when you started to get reviewers, you started to get papers in, and that's certainly true. For those of you that prefer their info in a table, the last slide just shows you the percentage change from 2022-23, which is the 3rd column down, compared to this year, 23-24. And we're slowly beginning to increase the numbers from Middle East, North Africa. You can see that we've increased the number of countries that we've got reviewers from. The same is true from Southeast Asia. We've increased countries, and we're maintaining and increasing at the same time. And with that, my last slide introduces the next section, which I believe is questions and answers. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to all of our speakers for those really interesting insights. Reminder to everyone in the session that you can post your questions in the Q&A. We have had one question so far. It's directed to Amina, but actually I think it would be useful to hear from everyone briefly. Could you please tell us more about your own journey in becoming involved in journal editing? So Amina, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Thank you. Let me see if I can my video successfully. Yeah, so thanks. That's a really interesting question. I think the journey is never really straightforward because I sit on the International Journal for Behavioral Development. Since being a student doing my PhD, I've been attending conferences for IGBD presenting. I've been working closely in the area, and I think having been within the space for a while, then people knew of my work, the kind of publications I do, and then it was easy for me to be invited into the editorial board. So I would say it's exposure to the conferences and, to interacting with colleagues within the space. Thank you.
Thank you. Rosa, how about you?
Yeah, not a dissimilar journey. I first worked as an associate editor for another journal, Molecular Autism, that is a bit more focused on biology side. And I then slowly changed my own research focus and started focusing much more on global perspectives on autism, started using more mixed methods and qualitative research methods that didn't really sit so well with the journal I was originally involved in, and then started reviewing a lot for the journal Autism. And I think based on that work was invited on the editorial board, and then was on the editorial board for a while. And then there was a vacancy for an editor position that I applied for. And by then I also had opinions relating to global representation. And I was glad to find that the appointment panel liked those opinions. So I then joined as an editor.
Thank you. Chloe?
Not a dissimilar story. So I guess several years post-PhD, I was well enough known. I was approached to be an associate editor of First Language. And then when the editor-in-chief stepped down, I was appointed in to replace him.
And Deborah?
Well, I was working with Brian when he set up CCPP. So, and CCPP has had a number of different editors and has changed its, I guess, the kind of like its focus over the years. But I've been an associate editor for a long time on the journal. And then 5 years ago, I was invited to come on board. I've been very impressed by the support that I've had from Sage, and I'm going to name check Terry Barner, who has been absolutely fabulous and incredibly supportive of promoting DEI. And every time I've come up with an idea, she said yes. So I've really enjoyed doing it, even though at times it was like I didn't realize quite how much work was involved. Yeah, I think it's been great fun, and it's rather lovely to have been able to be the editor of a journal of somebody who I first started my career working with.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious a little bit of time. I'm going to say a little bit about English language support, because a few of our speakers have mentioned this, and we've had a couple of questions about it. The question from Courtney Green is, would I mind expanding a little more on the English language editorial support programme Sage offers? Which I'm very happy to do. And so actually the work that was done on autism was kind of kicked us off on this endeavour a little, because we have known for a very long time, as I think most people are aware, that one of the most significant barriers that exists in terms of increasing representation of diverse voices is the fact that English has become the lingua franca for academic publishing, and so that is a very significant barrier, and it's one that's quite challenging to overcome in a way that is scalable. So essentially, with autism, Kerry worked on that journal and came up with a plan to offer for Sage to essentially cover the costs of language editing for a select number of authors to be selected by the editors. And that programme has since expanded. It's in a pilot phase at the moment, so it's quite a significant investment for Sage to make in terms of the financial cost. But it's something that we've sought to do in support of authors who are writing in English as a second or third language. And so far it's been made available, these waivers have been made available to editors across 30 journals in a pilot scheme. And we will be monitoring the uptake and the effectiveness of this project over time, with the aim to hopefully expand it in the future and make it more widely available. I think there's potentially also avenues to explore around AI and whether that's a way to kind of make language editing more sort of widely available at a more scalable, in a more scalable way. But I think there's a lot to kind of unpack with that and a lot to kind of explore. So it's very much an idea at this point, but it's something that I think we'd all be interested in learning more about. Do any of our panel members have specific thoughts on this issue of English language support?
Yes, do you want me to just jump in, Caroline? Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky because if the paper has not been written in a particularly, good English way, a lot of the time reviewers can't see past that, and they get very irritated by they feel that they're being asked to do a copy editing process, and so they get hung up on the grammar and the syntax and the punctuation, and they get really irritated by it, and they forget to look at the science. And so I do think it's really important for them to understand that that if they are reviewing a paper that comes from a country where perhaps authors, don't have access to English as first language speakers or people who can help them edit, that they are encouraged to review for science first, and that then, and I think this is such an important I think if publishers are committed to DEI in academic journals, this is an investment that they need to make, because otherwise they're just paying lip service to it, because otherwise people who can't write in good English, and there's a lot of English people that can't write in good English, we should also acknowledge, but there isn't that same degree, that same level of barrier, if you like, for people. And I'm always slightly humbled by the fact that somebody that comes from another country has been able, I would never be able to produce an entire article, unless I use Google Translate perhaps, but I would never be able to produce an entire scientific article. And I'm always humbled by the fact that, having traveled all around the world, I always get to present in English. So I think it's incumbent upon publishers to make that considerable investment.
Thanks, Deborah. Rosa, and then we'll move to another question.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I completely agree with the points Deborah made. So the journal Autism was the first in Sage's pilot to offer these waivers for language services. And so when we were made aware of that opportunity, the guest editors of the special issue discussed well, what's the moment where we would start using it? And we thought, no, we first still want to send the work out for review because we want independent assessors to be able to consider the work. But I really felt it was a powerful tool to be able to say in my editor cover letter, I want you to focus on the science. So I could steer the reviewers away from being annoyed about English and really covering the science. And then we were also wondering, how often would we use this? Is the number of waivers that we've received from SAGE, is it enough? And then what happened in practice was that by the time when we got papers back with reviewers' comments, at least once I said in my cover letter back to the authors, please do your best with the English, but we're aware it's not your first language. I have this opportunity to send it out, the next draft out for language editing if necessary. By the time it came back, through the reviews process, it was fine. In the end, we didn't use it. So this is also a message for SAGE, hopefully. This isn't actually such a massive investment, hopefully, in the end. I think it might be sustainable. It was the power of being able as an editor to say, this is an option, reviewers review the science, not the language, and you end up not even using it that much, would be my prediction.
Thank you, Rosa. And I don't want to preempt the pilot that we're doing across a large number of journals, but I think we're learning fast about that, and obviously it really keen to find ways of supporting this. I'm going to move on to another question just because I'm a little conscious of time, and there's been a couple of questions about collecting voluntary demographic data. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments about that, really, on why we're doing it and how we're doing it in a appropriate and ethical way. The reason for wanting to collect data about authors and editors and board members is so that we can understand at a sort of aggregate level what the makeup of the scholarly communities that we publish, what that makeup is, and therefore whether the various steps that we're taking to try and improve diversity, equity and inclusion are actually having an effect over time. So that's the kind of top level rationale for wanting to do it. I think it's important to say that the way that it's done, it's very important not to tie the data to individuals. The aim is to look at it from a kind of top level, so looking across SAGE, but also looking at different disciplines of study, and also looking at sort of particular journals and whether there are ways in which those journals are lacking in representation and what could be done as a result to improve it. Now, it's important to say that the tools that we have at our disposal at this point are limited. We are, as I mentioned very briefly, piloting the tool that Clarivate has made available via Scholar One, which is the submission and peer review system that SAGE and a number of other publishers use. And those questions are limited at this point to gender and race and ethnicity. So even as they currently stand, they're not sort of presenting a full picture, but it's to try and get a broad understanding on those two particular areas about the authors that are submitting. There are always options for authors to choose other or prefer not to say. So there is no obligation for authors to disclose their characteristics. But the idea is that over time we'll be able to understand our communities better and hopefully measure progress. With editors and editorial boards, the plan is to do a survey. Again, that's not a perfect way of gathering data. Any survey will only get a partial response, but it's from a current situation where we're not able to know for sure what the makeup of our communities are beyond a sort of geographical understanding. So there's a lot more to say on all of that, but I'm conscious that we're getting to the end of our session today, and I wondered if our panelists have any final comments on the data collection question.
I support it.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm conscious that we have had a number of questions that I don't think we're going to get an opportunity to answer in full, so apologies for that. Really appreciate everyone who has put in questions, and what we'll do is try and make a note of those questions, and as we plan future sessions, then hopefully we can use those questions to inform how we would approach future webinars on DEI related topics. I will hand over to Sean briefly just to wrap up the session and point to some further resources.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much to all of our panelists today. Thank you, Rosa, Deborah, Chloe, and Amina, for all of your very informative talks. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining today. We hope you found the session useful and helpful and answered some of your questions. I wanted to flag some upcoming webinars we have at SAGE. If there's anything else that might spark interest for you. On December 6th, we have another iteration of our How to Do Research and Get Published webinar series. This will be specifically focused on developing a research agenda and your own personal academic brand. So whether this webinar is something that you're interested in, or potentially something that someone in your network or someone you mentor might be interested in, we definitely would be happy to have you there. In addition, in 2024, we're hosting 11 more How to Do Research and Get Published webinars, one a month. So be on the lookout for those too, whether it's something, again, you're interested in joining, something you're interested with sharing with your network, or potentially if it's an area that you think that you could serve as a panelist, that's something we're open to hearing as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you again to all of our panelists and all of our speakers, and we hope to see you again in the future at a future SAGE webinar. So thank you very much and take care.